We're asking the question, who is Jesus, to draw folks in and have this conversation with us. But as a Christian organization, we are making a particular case for who Jesus is. We're arguing, we're putting forth our best reasons and evidence to believe that Jesus is God. But we invite, as you know, Christians, non-Christians, to join us in this conversation, push back against our argument, be exposed to the reasons and evidence Christians believe and what they believe. But we want anybody to come and join us, join as members, just come and participate in the conversation. As long as we can do it lovingly and respectfully, we invite that sort of interaction. So here's what we're talking about. Why should we believe that Jesus is God? Now I'm going to do like I've been doing every week, just a little rundown of this first argument. This first argument is taking us several weeks to work through all the pieces. So in a nutshell, you might have some copies of this at your table. If you do, go ahead and grab one. You can use it for notes, take it with you. Just helpful to have it in front of you as I go through this material. But the first thing we covered was the question, did Jesus even exist? Sometimes, at least at a popular level, you'll hear people argue against even the idea that there was a man, Jesus of Nazareth, that existed 2,000 years ago. But we saw, and we're continuing to see good evidence that Jesus did exist. The second question is, did Jesus claim to be God? There are some people who say that his disciples or Christians later invented this idea that he claimed to be God. But if we get back to the real historical Jesus, we'll find, so this theory goes, somebody who taught good things, yes, but never thought of himself as divine. But we saw and will continue to see good evidence that no, Jesus did think of himself as God. The next question logically comes, why should we believe his claim? I mean, let's be honest, lots of people have claimed to be God, but why should we believe his claim? And the simple answer that we gave for that is his miracles. The fact that he was able to do miraculous things provides that credibility or authentication that he really was God, because only God can do miracles. And Jesus himself said, this is why you should believe my claims, and then he performed miracles. So miracles is a very important part of this argument. The possibility of miracles, and then the fact that whether or not he really did do these miracles. Because this is such an important part, really I would say the cardinal key to this argument, everything hinges on it, we wanted to spend several weeks just making the case for the possibility of miracles. I gave a lecture on that, Wesley gave a lecture on that, and then we've invited, he hasn't been able to make it yet. Have we heard from Dr. Bashford yet?
Yes. He said he won't be able to make the November 6th deadline, so he's trying to push it back to next semester.
Oh.
And I asked him, you can do that, but just because we love you, but could you do any of them in between, either late November, early December? And he hasn't got back to me there.
So Dr. Bashford is one of the science professors at UNL, and we asked him to come and speak. He's our faculty advisor for our RSO, Ratio Christi. We asked him to give this lecture, the third one there, under number 3, Does Science Disprove Miracles? So even though he hasn't given that yet, we've moved on in the outline. We've got to kind of rain check on that lecture, as you just heard. So number 4 then. We mostly know about Jesus' claim to be God and his miracles from the New Testament. Not exclusively so, as we'll see tonight actually, but we mostly know about these things from the New Testament. So that causes us to ask the 5th question up here as we follow through this argument. And the 5th question simply is, are the New Testament documents trustworthy? Are they historically reliable? And so to answer this question, we're putting our historian hats on. We're not asking this question as theologians or even necessarily as Christians per se. We want to evaluate these 27 documents in the New Testament and ask the question, are they historically reliable? Now, if you are a Christian, you probably believe that these are more than just ancient historical documents. You might believe that they're God's Word, and we're going to make that argument next semester. But in the progress of this argument, we're not evaluating it at that level. We're merely evaluating it as ancient historical documents, okay? So this isn't a theological argument, this is a historical argument. And even if you are a Christian, you certainly believe these are ancient documents. And that's the level we're evaluating at least for now. The whole theme next semester is we're going to be making more of a theological argument that the Bible is God's Word. But we're not making that argument at this point in presenting a cumulative case for Christianity. So the first thing we looked at under question number 5 was, do we even have an accurate copy? We don't have the original New Testament anymore. All we have are copies. But can we, through the copies, recreate the original? And if you remember, if you were here that night, we ended that evening with a quote from a famous New Testament scholar at Princeton, Bruce Metzger, who said, according to his professional judgment, we can recreate the original New Testament based on all these copies, that there are differences and mistakes among them, but we can recreate the original with a very high degree of accuracy. In fact, Metzger famously said a 99.5% degree of accuracy. Pretty impressive for an ancient document. The next portion of number 5 then is to ask, why do we believe that they were telling the truth? Because we might have an accurate copy of a bunch of lies. And so what we've been doing now, we're in the midst of presenting 6 reasons why we as Christians, we as Ratio Christi at least, believe that the New Testament authors were telling the truth when they recorded these things, and specifically Jesus' miracles, because that's the hinge that this argument rests upon. We believe his claim to be God because he was able to do things that only God can do, miracles. As we said, these are the type of things that historians look at or look for when they're trying to determine if an ancient document's telling the truth. And it's also, interestingly enough, it's things that detectives, lawyers, and judges look for when they evaluate witnesses. So you think of maybe like a crime scene, maybe a murder took place, and the detective is trying to figure out who done it, right? Who committed the murder. And they might have people who claim to be eyewitnesses, and so they'll evaluate them, because not all people are telling the truth, of course. They have to evaluate them carefully to see if they can tell if they're telling the truth about what they saw or if they're lying. So these sort of things are what lawyers, judges, and attorneys, detectives are looking for. It has caused then not only historians to be very interested and to write books about this particular subject, the historical reliability of the New Testament, but also people from the legal field. The last few weeks I've been bringing, every night, I've been bringing a few resources and people, names who are fairly well known in this field, okay? And here's the one I wanted to tell you about tonight. You might have heard of this guy before. His name is Lee Strobel. And as you can see, he got his master's degree in law at Yale. He was he was a journalist at the Chicago Tribune, very renowned journalist, for 14 years. He was an atheist, by the way, at this time. But he set out on an investigation using his law degree, using his skills as a journalist, to evaluate the New Testament authors to see if he could tell if they were lying or telling the truth. And when he started out, he thought it was a myth, and so his goal was to disprove their testimony, their supposed eyewitness testimony. But he concluded by the end of his investigation that no, they are reliable, and concluded that they were telling the truth, and became a Christian. Since then, he's written several books, and there's been a lot of videos. There was even a Hollywood movie made about his life a couple years ago, which I highly recommend. It's a great movie. He's not in it. It's a movie about his life, but very well done, even for a Christian movie. The acting and the art is fairly well done, and I recommend it. So his most famous book, the book that came out as a result of his 2-year investigation, is called The Case for Christ. And while he is not, let me say this carefully, he is not somebody you could quote as an academic source, because he doesn't have a terminal degree in these things, right? He's very useful at a popular level. But what makes him very valuable and helpful is that his book records how he went around and he interviewed scholars in this field. And so you have a record of his interview with these folks who have terminal degrees and university positions, who are more quotable in an academic sense. I hope you guys know what I mean by that. For instance, there's a lot of good popular level authors out there that are helpful and good and informative, but you can't quote them, when you're writing a paper at a university like UNL. Even me, right? You couldn't quote me in terms of this material because this isn't my speciality. You could possibly, at least maybe a year from now, quote me in the realm of philosophy, because I'm going to earn my PhD in philosophy, and I have a few articles that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. My first book is coming out next year with Routledge, which is an academic publisher. So in that field, soon, you could possibly quote me. But in this field, this historical field, I don't have a terminal degree. So I want to continue, and nor does he. So though his material is good, it wouldn't be a book or a source you would want to quote in an official academic paper. Instead, what I have for you tonight is one that could be. So it's very similar material, but it's going to be more in-depth, more academic, more details. It's not going to break it down as simply and as entertainingly for you, but it's an academic resource. So 2 authors, one of them I'll just tell you, D.A. Carson. He got his PhD terminal degree in this field at Cambridge. So, can't get much higher than Oxford, Cambridge in terms of terminal degrees. And so he is a New Testament scholar. This is what he specializes in. So this would be a great academic resource you should be familiar with if you want to go down this route or write a paper. I always encourage students, if you ever get the freedom to choose your topic in any class, choose one of these topics and write on these issues when you get the opportunity. I want to say, just before we move on tonight, I want to say just a little bit about this field of New Testament scholarship. I've said some things over the last few weeks that I think have caused a little bit of confusion. But think about it for just a moment. The terms I've used when it comes to New Testament scholarship, I've talked about how there's conservative New Testament scholars, and there's what are referred to as liberal New Testament scholars. But this has nothing to do with conservative or liberal ethics or conservative versus liberal politics, right? What's meant by those 2 terms are usually the attitude they bring to their work, if that makes sense. So let me try to explain it this way. Most of the conservative New Testament scholars are going to be Christians, right? And so, all else being equal, they're going to give the benefit of the doubt to Christianity being true. In other words, let me just give you an example. Let's say that my wife, Kristen, was accused of murder, right? Now, being her husband, I would have a conservative, if you will, view of whether she really committed this murder or not. It would take a lot of evidence to convince me that she really was the murderer, because my default position would be that she's not, because I've known her for so long and I just couldn't imagine, her committing murder. But let's say there's somebody else who is more her enemy. I don't know, invent somebody, call him Larry, and Larry, for whatever reason, just doesn't like my wife. He's always disagreed with her about things. He would be more prone, all else being equal, to think that she is the murderer, right? So you could say that Larry would be more liberal. All else being equal, he's going to swing to the side of disbelieving her innocence. Does that make sense? Now you might think to yourself, well, why don't we just get somebody who's objective? Why don't we just get somebody who has no biases and can be completely neutral in this? And I would say to you, well, good luck. Good luck finding that perfect, objective, neutral party. I've come to the point where I've concluded that that person just doesn't exist. Even in the realm of science, the idea of pure objectivity, I mean, you tell me that a scientist who wants to get published and has a hypothesis and is trying to prove his case is not biased towards proving it, you've got to be kidding me. We all have biases. This idea of pure objectivity, pure neutral, no biases, is one of those myths of the modern era, akin to trying to reach for absolute certainty. So what you have are, liberal scholars, many of them who are, let's say, atheists, who are not prone to accept supernatural things. And so they have that bias. And then you have more conservative scholars, and they're more prone, because they believe, let's say, that God does exist, they're more open to the possibility of miracles. And so that's the type of scholarship. And when you read, you have to ask yourself, well, what biases are they bringing to the table? And so what I'm giving you tonight, at least in that book, is an example of a conservative scholar. And you should be aware of both. I'll give you just one example from last week. So we had a question come up about 2 Peter and the authorship of 2 Peter. And the vast majority of liberal scholars would argue that 2 Peter really wasn't written by Peter, whereas conservative scholars will try to make a case for Peter being the author. So in that book, written by a conservative New Testament scholar, very good credentials, PhD from Cambridge, he will lay out in 5 or 6 pages, you can look it up if you'd like, 5 or 6 pages, where he lays out the evidence that liberal scholars have provided or presented against the authorship of 2 Peter, and then he responds to those and quotes conservative scholars pushing back against that argument. So whenever you're writing a paper or thinking through these things, you want to look at both sides and not just accept one or the other, but look at their arguments. Right? This isn't an appeal to authority. At the end of the day, we're evaluating the arguments that they're presenting. Okay, well, let's move on. Like I said, these are the 6 reasons we're presenting to believe that the New Testament authors were telling the truth. And we've worked our way now to reason number 3. We're going to do number 3 and 4 tonight. And 3 is very compelling to me. 3 is simply the fact that their stories, the things that they wrote in the New Testament, are confirmed or corroborated by others. As we said, the New Testament is actually made up of 27 books or letters written by 9 different authors. And so we have, just from the New Testament, 9 independent eyewitness sources. And now we're asking and showing how their story, the 9, their story has been corroborated by others. First with archaeology, and then by other ancient writers, historians. So, give you an example, just a few ways to set up this archaeology. There was a time where people questioned whether Pontius Pilate was even a real person. Some claimed that Pontius Pilate was just an invention that would fit well into the myth that is the story of the New Testament. However, that idea that Pontius Pilate was just an invented person was completely put to rest in 1961 when archaeologists discovered what's known as the Pilate Stone. And all scholars who have evaluated this agree that this stone does say Pontius Pilate on it. And even mentions, I think, the region that he governed, if I remember right. So now virtually everybody agrees that Pontius Pilate was a real-life person. Yeah, it says Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, on the stone. Another example how archaeology has confirmed the story of the New Testament. We've actually discovered what is possibly the bones of Caiaphas. If you remember the New Testament story, Caiaphas was the high priest who sentenced Jesus to death. But in 1990, we discovered this ossuary, which many scholars believe contained the bones of Caiaphas. Now, not all scholars are in agreement on this. I want to, be transparent here, but there's good evidence pointing to Caiaphas as a real historical person as well. Some have even questioned, not so much today, but in the past, some people have dismissed the New Testament completely because they claimed that there wasn't crucifixion taking place in Jerusalem in the first century. They said, there's no way the New Testament is true because crucifixion wasn't even being practiced there at that time in that region. And that theory, that myth theory, was completely shot down in 1968 when crucifixion bones were discovered in Jerusalem. Now, this is all they discovered was this ankle to the right, and the one on the left is an artist's remaking of the entire ankle and foot, so you can see what it looked like originally. But it's been confirmed by archaeologists that no, this is from a crucifixion that took place in Jerusalem in the first century. So what this tells us, at least from archaeology, is that crucifixion was happening at that time in Jerusalem. So it's fascinating. If this is stuff that you really enjoy, I would encourage you to find some books. I can give you some resources if you want to continue going down this path of looking at the archaeological evidence that confirms the New Testament. But I'll give you this quote just to kind of sum things up. This is from U.S. News and World Report. It wrote, "In extraordinary ways, modern archaeology has affirmed the historical core of the Old and New Testaments, corroborating key points of the stories of Israel's patriarchs, the Exodus, the Davidic monarchy, and the life and times of Jesus." So the next thing I want to do is look at ancient writers, and specifically ancient historians. Now, these are non-Christian, then, authors from the ancient world. We've got the 9 sources from the New Testament. Those are really the ones that we're evaluating. And so we're looking at these extra-biblical sources, these non-Christian sources, to see if they corroborate what the New Testament authors said. Okay? So let's look at a few examples of that. The first one I want to draw your attention to is a guy by the name of Tacitus. Tacitus lived in the first century, died 117 AD. He was a Roman senator and a historian, not a Christian. And he wrote in his official records, history books if you want to call it that, he wrote that Jesus was put to death by the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate. And this happened during the reign of Tiberius. So this is what Tacitus recorded. And we know from history that Tiberius reigned from 14 to 37 AD. So this puts the crucifixion right in the same time period according to the New Testament authors, who, as best as we can tell, are saying that the cross happened in the early 30s. Okay? The next one I want to draw your attention to is Josephus. Josephus, also from the first century. He was a historian for the Emperor Domitian. Not a Christian. Now I will, full transparency, most of these ancient documents, just like the New Testament, there's several copies of, and we have to look at the various copies to try to recreate the original. That's just how all ancient documents work. And there are some copies that we have of Josephus where a Christian copier added more details about the scenario. Does that make sense? So it's imagine, if you will, a Christian. We do the same things today. We'll write notes maybe in the side of a book. If we're reading it or copying it, we'll add our own thoughts to it. So if some versions of Josephus's work that were copied by a Christian, they'll have added some details, adding more information to the account. But just like textual critics of the New Testament, textual critics of Josephus's work worked very hard to try to recreate the original. And so what I'm quoting you from is what historians agree was in the original Josephus. None of this extra stuff that was added by a Christian copier. We do have some copies of Josephus that don't have that additional material added. So if we look at just the pure Josephus, if you will, he said that Jesus was known as a wise man, had many followers, said like Tacitus that he was crucified under Pilate. And he also recorded that his disciples claimed that he rose again on the third day. Now, Josephus didn't believe that. If you read the original Josephus, it's very clear he didn't think that Jesus rose on the third day. What he's recording, though, is that these Christians, these followers of Jesus, thought he rose on the third day. And so if you want to continue down this path, we're not going to look at all of these ancient sources, but I wanted you just to be aware of all of them. There's at least 10. There may be more, but I'm at least familiar with 10 of these ancient non-Christian sources. Some of them we've talked about already: Josephus, Tacitus. There's a few others which I won't dare try to pronounce. Historians, government officials, and then some other sources. Now again, these aren't Christians, right? So they don't have that bias per se towards Christianity. They're just recording for historical purposes what happened, or what other people believe happened. It's fairly incredible to have these ancient sources, because 2,000 years ago, the longer you are from the time of the events, the less and less material you have to work with. That just makes sense, right, from the ancient world. So the fact that we have 10 of these ancient non-Christian sources is fairly remarkable. In other words, compare it to this. You all know who Tiberius Caesar is, right? One of the most famous individuals from history, Tiberius Caesar. He was the emperor of Rome during the time of Jesus. And we only have 9 non-Christian ancient sources that mention Tiberius Caesar. So think about that for a moment. We only have 9 ancient non-Christian sources that mention Tiberius Caesar. So there's a sense in which Jesus is more well attested than Caesar. Well, folks have done the work, the New Testament scholars, and I'm really thankful for and lean upon their scholarship, their work, since this isn't my field. I, as many others, lean, on their scholarly work. They have compiled everything that we can know about Jesus and the early Christians just from these non-Christian sources. Okay, so you understand what we're doing now? If, let's say, we didn't have the New Testament at all, we didn't have these 9 supposed eyewitness sources in the New Testament, all we had were these 10 non-Christian sources. What could we recreate, or what kind of story comes forth about Jesus and his early disciples, if that's all the information we had? We'll take a look at this. There's 12 things that we would know, at least 12. We would know from these 10 non-Christian sources that Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. We would know he lived a virtuous life, that he was acclaimed to be a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pilate. This is interesting. An eclipse and an earthquake occurred when he died. It's recorded by non-Christian sources. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. Again, these aren't Christians, so they don't believe he literally rose, but they record what his disciples believed. These non-Christian sources affirm that his disciples were willing to die for their belief. That'll come up next week. And we'll evaluate the importance of that. Number 11, Christianity spread very quickly and very rapidly as far as Rome from Jerusalem. And his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshipped Jesus as God. So that's pretty incredible. I mean, that's basically what the New Testament says. In terms of corroboration, lawyers, detectives, judges, people like Lee Strobel, this really impresses them that these so-called 9 eyewitnesses have folks who corroborate their story. Those that would be unbiased, so to speak, because they're not Christians. So let me turn over to you guys. I've talked for quite a while now, but at Ratio Christi, what we like to do is give you guys a few minutes every so often and talk about these issues and discuss at your table. So here's a question I'll have you guys discuss. I'll give you a few minutes. If the New Testament author's claims are confirmed by others who weren't Christians, how much does this increase the likelihood they were telling the truth? Let's say you're kind of in the middle, you're not sure whether to believe the New Testament authors or not, and if you evaluated the situation much more than just the last 20 minutes that I just rapid fired or just gave you all these facts. If you evaluated this information and came to believe, based on all the scholarly work, that their story was corroborated by these 10 non-Christian sources, how much would that move you, or at all, down the continuum of being convinced they were telling the truth? In other words, how valuable in our being able to know the truthfulness of their account, how valuable is this to the case? So I'll give you guys a few minutes to chat about that. All right, well, remember what we're not claiming in all of this. Remember what we're not claiming. We're not claiming that we can prove these things with absolute certainty, right? There's no silver bullet that is going to, there's no archaeological discovery, there's no ancient, document or source that's going to prove Jesus did these miracles with absolute certainty. But just recognize lawyers, judges, detectives, historians, none of them are looking to establish their case with absolute certainty. That level of certainty is just impossible for us as finite creatures. So all that historians, detectives, lawyers, judges do is provide the best evidence they can to make their case. So even in a court of law, there's no standard of absolute certainty by any means. That's never a standard in any court of law. Beyond reasonable doubt is a common standard in a court of law. All right, let's move on to number 4. And this is a fact that they record embarrassing details. Now that might sound a little bit odd to you at first. You might think, well, why would this make their testimony more likely true? Let me ask you a question to help set this up. Have you ever told a lie? Raise your hand if you've ever told a lie before. And if you're not raising your hand, then you are telling a lie right now, right? We all have lied. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever lied to make yourself look better than you really are? Right? Have you ever lied to make yourself look worse than you really are? We might do that sometimes, self-deprecating humor. I'm a huge fan of like Jim Gaffigan, Brian Regan, those type of comedians. And they're probably telling lies, as to be humorous. But most of the time when we lie, we're doing so to make ourselves look better, to get out of trouble. We usually don't lie to get into trouble, unless it's a very odd situation, right? Usually our lies is to make people think more highly of us, whether we're lying about our height or our weight, or our age, whatever it is, our lies are usually to make us look better. Now, detectives, lawyers, judges, historians know this, and so when they evaluate a supposed eyewitness's testimony, and it includes a bunch of material that makes them look bad, all else being equal, the detective, lawyer, judge, historian is more likely to believe their testimony is true because they just understand human nature and purpose of lying. And so if the New Testament authors, in their account of what happened, include a lot of embarrassing material about themselves, then all else equal, this is how historians and those in the legal context evaluate this, all else being equal, it's more likely that they're telling the truth. So, embarrassing things. If you're a Christian, you might think to yourself, well, what's embarrassing about the disciples in the New Testament? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'll remind you. Take a look at this. So in the New Testament, the disciples record themselves being very dense, to put it lightly. They constantly fail to understand what Jesus is saying. If I'm writing the New Testament and I'm making it up, I'm like Jesus' prize student. I'm always, getting the answer first. I'm like teacher's pet. I'm not going to record in there that I was the class dunce if I'm making it up. They record the fact that they're uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus twice. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. In fact, somebody from the enemy team, Joseph of Arimathea, has to come and bury Jesus, which was a huge deal. It's still a huge deal, but back then even more so. And they made no effort to bury their leader, which would be very embarrassing on them. So if they're lying, if they're making up this story, there wouldn't be motivation to include these sort of embarrassing details in the story. They record the fact that they are rebuked. You might remember the story of when Jesus calls Peter Satan. Peter was the leader of the early church, right? Probably not a good idea if you're trying to make up a new pretend religion, which is led by this guy named Peter, to then go out and tell everybody that, God called our leader Satan. Probably not a good move if you're making this stuff up. But if it actually happened and they're just recording it, just gives them more credibility. Peter's also rebuked by Paul, kind of a Johnny-come-lately, so to speak. Who's this Paul guy that's dissing our key leader of the early church? So that would seem strange, if they're making all this up. They record the fact that they're cowards. Now, this is great. I love this part of it. So in the New Testament, you probably remember this story. First, let me mention that Peter denies Christ 3 times before the rooster crows. You remember that story? So Peter, again, the key leader, is recorded as a coward. But even more powerful than that, they record the disciples themselves running away and cowering and hiding after Jesus is arrested and then crucified. If you remember in the New Testament, that it records the disciples are hiding out. They're scared. They don't know what to do. They're cowards. Jesus is gone. He's been crucified. This is before the resurrection, of course. And the disciples are cowards. They don't know what to do. And it's who that go to the tomb? It's the women. Now, if a guy was writing this story, right? If a man, I'll be sexist for a moment because I'm a man and I can be sexist against men. If a man was writing this story and it's made up, right? There's no man that would make up a story that he, as the man, was at home cowering while the women went to the tomb, right? If a man was going to make up this story, he would claim that he went down to the soldiers and confronted them and demanded the body. And, after they arm wrestled the soldiers and won. Then they went back and they cowered all the women who were crying back at home. If a man was going to make up the story, that's what he would say. So the fact that they record themselves as the cowards and the women as the brave ones is quite embarrassing, which helps their case for the historicity of the story. They record themselves as doubting. Again, think about this. If you're making up a religion and you're trying to convince people to make up this stuff that you know is a lie, why would you tell everybody that at first none of you believed either? Why would you record yourselves as a bunch of doubters? But that's exactly how the story goes. Despite being told that Jesus was going to rise from the dead, they were doubtful of the resurrection when it did happen. All right, and then last but not least, they even record embarrassing things about Jesus. So again, this just helps their case, at least the historicity of their case, if they're recording all of these embarrassing things about, the man who they're claiming to be God. I mean, if they're just making up this as a legend, if they're just making up this myth about Jesus being God, why in the world would they say that many people, including his own family, thought he was insane? Why would they record that many of his followers left him? Why would they record, again, if they were just making this up as a story, a myth, why would they record that even his own brothers didn't believe him? It's recorded that many people thought Jesus was a deceiver. The religious leaders despised him so much that they wanted to stone him. They recorded that a lot of people thought he was a madman and a drunkard and demon-possessed. And why would you include all these things if you're trying to promote him? The fact that he supposedly had a prostitute around him, often even washing his feet with her hair, was very scandalous. If you're trying to promote this person as a great moral example, teacher, God in the flesh, and you're making the story up, it would seem odd to include those sort of things. And the fact that he was hung on a tree, which for that culture, that Jewish culture in the first century, was a huge curse to be hung on a tree like that. And so if you're trying to promote this guy as God and you're making this up, it wouldn't seem very likely that you would put him under God's curse. Does that make sense? So similar to the previous point, let's have another discussion at your table about this issue. If the New Testament authors include all these embarrassing details in their story of what happened, how much does this, all else being equal, how much does that increase the likelihood that they were telling the truth? So I give you guys a few minutes to chat about that. We often say here, at Ratio Christi, I hate to cut you guys off in the midst of your conversations, but one thing we always say is that these little 3, 4, 5 minute periods of conversation are just supposed to be the beginning of the discussion. So we'll wrap it up here in a few minutes, and you guys are free to hang out here or get coffee in a couple days and chat about this material. So I feel bad cutting you off, but just know that these are supposed to be just the beginning of the conversations, right? And they should continue. I thought I'd wrap it up a little bit by talking about cults. I'm very fascinated by cults. I always have been. I was your guys' age or even a little bit younger when David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, that whole debacle happened in Waco, Texas in the 90s. I'm going to start working on a book about cults. So I've already read a lot about cults. And one thing, if we would assume from the get-go that these cults are false, and usually they are focused on a particular charismatic leader, right? Not all of them, but a lot of them are founded or led by a key leader, personality, strong personality. And one thing that I've noticed in studying and doing some research about cults is that there is so much work done within the cult and in the communication to those outside the cult, trying to elevate that leader, right? You know what I'm saying? To make that leader look good, to never make that leader look bad, because they're doing, among many other things, a lot of psychological manipulation, but they're trying to elevate this certain person and put them on such a pedestal that you never, they work, the leader himself, almost as a dictator of information to squash any sort of embarrassing details about that leader. Does that make sense? And so I see when I research this and I see this in cults happen again and again and again, this control of information and always making the leader look good. When I've studied the New Testament and read the New Testament, to me it comes across drastically different, starkly different to that scenario. The other thing I wanted to mention as we close here is that it's always easy to come up with conspiracy theories, right? It's always easy to throw out possibilities. Well, could this have happened? Could that have happened? Could Judas have died on the cross instead of Jesus and they were just confused? All sorts of possible theories, and we'll talk about some of those other theories. It's very easy to throw out possibilities and various theories, conspiracy theories. But the question I always ask is, what evidence do you have for your theory? It's easy to throw out a theory, but you can gently and just, lovingly, I think respectfully say, what first century eyewitness testimony do you have to back up your theory? I get into this conversation a lot with Muslims, gentle conversations that I'm having with a Muslim. In particular, I remember one very great conversation. He was my driver in Charlotte, taking me from one location to the next, a taxi driver, and was Muslim. We had a great conversation about our differences and religious beliefs. And I just said, by the time we got to the end of the conversation, Muslims believe that Jesus was just a prophet. They don't believe he was actually God in the flesh, right? They don't think he ever claimed to be God even. So I said, look, we're both finite creatures. We're both, going on, limited information. We've got to make a decision. But compare what we have. I've got first century eyewitness testimony for my claims that Jesus thought of himself as God and did miracles. And what you have on your side, you have somebody 600 years later who supposedly had an angel tell him in a cave these things about Jesus. So just from a pure historical perspective, historical evidence, I've got, all this that we went through, plus everything we're going through this semester. I've got this first century eyewitness testimony, and all you have to go on is a guy in a cave who supposedly heard from an angel who said that Jesus wasn't God. So if you just want to compare the historical evidence, yeah, I know you have a theory, and it is a possibility, right? Certainly it's a possibility, but let's compare evidence for the two theories and see which one is more substantial.